we'll start to select a product, and the next step really is to determine what personal protective equipment will be necessary. And it's important to note that this PPE will vary between countries and between products. So I have here as an example, on the left-hand side is the Zentari product in Thailand. And so here for mixing, a face covering and gloves are required for mixing, and a mask and gloves are required for application. Now, another BT in Indonesia, in this case, the Dipel SC formulation, requires similar tools for mixing, but requires full protective equipment, a full body covering for actually making the application. This can vary between products. This can vary between different formulations within the same country. So it's important to look at the, you can use these really easy tools to look at what PPE is going to be required. Now, I think it's important to note that personal protective equipment is determined based on two things. One is just a baseline level of protection that local authorities think is important, but it's also based on actual toxicology. So applying these products to, more often than not, animal models to look for a reaction. So if a pesticide label has specific requirements to protect yourself, it's usually for a really good reason. And there is, in most cases, some potential harm that can happen. So reading the label, looking at protective equipment is really the important place to start to ensure that you yourself are protected when making applications. Now, mixing a BT is really a lot like all other agrochemicals. There are only a few specific considerations to make that I'd like to focus on here. So as you can see, the example I have here is a wettable granule formulation. That label probably looks familiar. This video was collected in Thailand. And so with commercial BTs, one important consideration to make is that those crystals and spores, as we mentioned at the beginning, are insoluble by nature. And so for that reason, pre-mixing and really thorough mixing before loading it into the tank can be valuable to ensure that, especially with these granule formulations, the material is well dispersed prior to going into the tank. Now, commercial BTs, whether they're a dry formulation like you see here, or even the liquid formulations, may settle with time. So commercial BTs are insoluble by nature, and therefore settling may occur with time. Even though BT do not necessarily dissolve completely, they are formulated not to block nozzles. So seeing this amount of material on the bottom after mixing isn't necessarily a problem. It's more often expected. And any commercial BT you're using, that dissolves completely is unlikely to be a BT, as commercial BTs should not be completely soluble. You should expect to see settling with time. And that's just a matter of the fact that we're using a bacteria. Unlike chemical insecticides that will fully dissolve and will stay within, become a solution where you'll have the chemical insecticide throughout the whole volume of water. With commercial BTs, it's important to continually agitate if possible to ensure that you're continually mixing those crystals and spores and keeping them in suspension. So those are the two distinctions between a commercial BT and a chemical insecticide. Is with a chemical insecticide, we have a solution, and with BTs, we have a suspension. Which means that we have to treat it as such when we're making that application. Now, normally, after mixing and then going out into the field with, say, a backpack sprayer, the level of settling, you wouldn't expect to see a level of settling in a backpack before the entire volume is sprayed. But again, even if you do see in your pre-mixing, in the slurry mixing, if you do see some of that settling, it's not necessarily mean it's going to cause issues with the application. Now, it's important here also to mention to always follow label recommendations for application rate. And that's because application rates are based on efficacy trials. to achieve a specific level of performance. And of course, this will vary from product to product. Lower BT rates means less cry protein on the plant surface, leading to greater performance variability. That's really the thing that we're considering here. The insects will, in those cases, consume fewer BT crystals in a given feeding area, which means that they can cause more damage before being controlled, or can survive long enough to get into later larval stages where they're less susceptible. So this graph on the right shows relative efficacy versus on the bottom here, percent BT toxin crystal density relative to a labeled rate. So for example, 100% would mean a full labeled rate of the commercial product. And on the left-hand side, that would mean a 25%. The far left-hand side would be a 25% of that application rate. And what you see here is that at the higher application rates, there's just greater performance, less variability in performance. Now, on the left-hand side, even at the lowest application rates, in this case, probably levels that are below the label recommendation, you may still see good efficacy. In some cases, if the timing is right, if the population is of a certain level, even low application rates can yield very good results. However, you are opening yourself up to a greater variability. And that's really why it's important to follow the label recommendations to ensure that you're going to get what you pay for, especially if you're timing the applications right to ensure that you're meeting that economic threshold. Then you know that you're going to get the most value out of that application. Now, BT work through ingestion, so application volume actually also matters quite a bit. Larvae can survive a sublethal dose of those BT insecticidal proteins, so over-diluting can also impede activity. Here we have an image on the right-hand side where just to show the concentration effect, because here we have this physical material that we're spraying. So if spray volume increases either under heavy pressure or with larger plants, it may be necessary to increase the dosage. Of course, always read and follow label instructions and adhere to those recommended rates. But in VBC, for example, we often use a suggested concentration for the dry formulations, the granule formulations. 1 gram per liter is often our recommended rate to get very consistent, very consistent performance in the field. And of course, it'll vary by product, but keeping concentration in mind is also important to ensure that enough material is getting out into the field to get good coverage of the leaf surface. So here's some of that really cool footage that we collected in Thailand. And here's an example of a really efficient application. Now, I'll mention for the 20th time that commercial BTs are insoluble, and therefore there's no systemic activity. So only foliage that's covered with that spray is going to be protected. Now, for that reason, ensuring complete coverage of the leaf surface, but also inside the plant, trying to get that spray into the whorl can be very important. The early larval stages will feed on the outer leaves, but very quickly those insects will move towards the inner portion of the corn plant. So ensuring that you get enough spray that some of it can drip down into the whorl can ensure that that you'll get good coverage of as much as possible the inner surfaces as well, so that when larvae do move into those inner surfaces, they can be effectively controlled. Because unlike systemic insecticides, where that chemical will move into the whorl naturally as it spreads throughout the plant, these BTs really have to be put where they're going to do the work. Now, here's an example of a poor application, a bit cheeky, where you can see that the application is being made very quickly and high above the foliage. So you're not necessarily getting down deep into the foliage, where you can ensure that both that all of the lower leaves are treated as well, because the larvae will move throughout the plant. they'll begin more often towards the top, but eventually move their way down. So ensuring that you're really getting down into the getting down into the crop is critically important to get the most out of that BT application. And application equipment actually can make a really big impact on that. This study here is an example of a study we had done in South Africa, looking at the penetration of different spraying techniques towards really deep into the inner canopy of, in this case, grapevines. So a very different crop, but the concept applies through all crops. So these used 3 different application techniques. On the left-hand side, these are yellow reactive cards. So when exposed to water, that yellow will turn blue. So you can see using a handheld mist blower, which does have a very powerful spray, but was relatively inefficient at treating the inner canopy. In the middle is an air blast sprayer, which is far more effective at getting good coverage, as that technology can really power through the foliage and ensure that it's getting deep within the canopy. And really, the best coverage that we saw in this particular study was using fogging. Fogging can be one of the best application techniques, especially if the timing is just right, to ensure that the fog really settles onto the crop. Can give the best coverage of any application type, making sure that it would get well into the crop and into all parts of the plant. So application technique is really important. And so for that reason, ensuring that your equipment is calibrated, changing spray nozzles to get a smaller, changing spray nozzles so that they continue to give the appropriate droplet profiles is important to making sure you get the most out of a commercial BT application, since coverage is so important. I know it's not just for BTs, but for all agrochemicals. Making sure that your equipment is properly calibrated is always a great place to start. Now, BT can be applied using really any common sprayers: backpack sprayers, broadcast sprayers, mist blowers, even ultra low volume sprayers like eco fogging or even thermal fogging can be an effective use for commercial BTs. Some of the Valent commercial labels actually have chemigation and overhead sprinklers included, as well as a real common use for commercial BTs is through aerial application, either by fixed wing or by helicopter. Some of these application techniques, not necessarily backpack sprayers, but can be under immensely high pressure. And it's just interesting to note that high pressures really don't affect the crystals or spores. They're not necessarily, so even the extremely high pressures that are experienced during an aerial application or in those ultra low volume sprayers don't affect the product, don't affect the efficacy of the product at all. And so I'll pause here again for any questions about the actual application of the commercial BTs.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Look, if people got questions, please put them in the Q&A. That would be most helpful. That was actually really interesting. I really enjoy seeing the videos. It really kind of brings it to life, and I really liked the video of the person spraying as well, because you could really see, yeah, just the height, I guess, of what they were spraying at and how fast they were moving through. So really nicely done, Daniel, showing us those key messages. I guess, well, there's a couple of questions here. And maybe I'll just start around the spray nozzles. Calibration of equipment is really important. You've really emphasized that. Is that, does someone have to go out and buy a whole lot of different spray nozzles? Because you said you use different spray nozzles, or is that information readily available as well? Where do people find that type of information around calibration of their equipment?
So for the, at least I can speak for Valent Biosciences, that we don't necessarily give specific recommendations on nozzle types that should be used when applying commercial BTs. Maybe Chris might have more specific recommendations. There may be local recommendations, but maybe asking your local retailer or whoever you buy the products from is probably a good place to start. When it comes to BTs, our objective is good coverage, which means that we want a relatively small droplet pattern. So with that being the case, then using nozzles that can give you that kind of efficient coverage would be important. But to my knowledge, we don't have information on the specific differences between nozzle types in an agrochemical setting.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's just a sort of practical question. It's something that maybe could be useful. A question here from Pierre around what about the costs and the availability in retailer shops of BT biopesticides? So it's getting back to kind of a common question that we have that pops up a lot around, is it affordable? So I'm sort of going back a little bit. It sort of relates to our application because you have to be able to afford it and purchase it first.
That's right.
Before you apply it.
No,
so tell us, Daniel, I mean, what and who is that's an interesting question as well. I mean, because there's different sellers in the marketplace. There's the local sort of shop just down the road that will sell all sorts of things sometimes. Is that where you're going to find a BT biopesticide? Or are you going to find it in a particular distributor that specializes in BT biopesticides? Where do people find it, and is it an affordable option?
So I can't speak specifically to what's going to be available where, but nowadays especially we see a really a dramatic increase in the availability of different types of commercial BTs, really covering a number of different price points. Yeah. The BT is manufactured by Valent Biosciences and sold through Sumitomo Chemical. We've developed these products over, I mean, we're coming up on 5 decades being in the marketplace. We put a certain level of emphasis on concentration and on the quality of the formulations. So those products may be a higher cost and might not necessarily be accessible to every grower. That being said, there is a great deal of local production nowadays, and some imported from other areas within Asia that are more cost effective. And that might be more accessible to say a farmer who's growing a smaller, who's growing corn on a smaller farm.
Yeah.
It's always important to keep in mind though that you should really rely on the experiences of those around you. Growing BTs is it's microbiology more than it is chemistry. So you can't so easily measure how much of the active ingredient is in the final product. It's not as easy as maybe synthesizing a chemical where you have a very specific way of measuring what's in it. So knowing the quality of the product is going to be pretty tough. And so relying on the expertise and the experiences of local researchers that can test those different products and give you some advice on which ones are working best. And of course, talking to your neighbors about what they're using and what's working for them can sort of help you identify those commercial BTs that are going to give you the best result for your money.
Yep, excellent. No, that makes sense. Thanks for that. It was just this pops up a lot. This sort of question, of course, and it's a really important one. Okay, so what we might do is we might move on to the next. I've actually got a couple of questions, people that I'm sort of holding to the end as well, because there's some sort of future sort of focus questions there that I want to ask you at the end, Daniel. So I'm saving a few. But listen, also if you do have questions, people on the application, don't forget to ask it, because here's your expert. There's one question here though that's just popped in. Is there an influence of temperature or direct sunlight? Does that make an impact on how you apply?
Actually, so that's a perfect transition into the next slide that I have, and that was this is actually a very common question and a common misnomer about commercial BTs is whether they need to be applied at night. I've spoken to farmers who have sort of put together, rigs with floodlights and things like that, so they can make applications specifically at night. And it's important to note that commercial BTs don't necessarily need to be applied at a specific time of day. However, applying in the morning or the evening is best, because making that application when the pest is active ensures that they'll eat the product right away. As I mentioned before, commercial BTs have they'll survive on the leaf, or they'll remain active on the leaf for 3 to 5 days. So making an application at a particular time of day really isn't so consequential, because we get a longer duration of activity than, say, with some other biopesticides. Now, that being said, the relative daytime temperatures, things like that, or even nighttime temperatures, don't affect the product themselves, but they do affect the insect's habit. Since BTs work through ingestion, temperatures that exceed what's comfortable for the insect will cause them to stop feeding and make them maybe cause them to become lethargic, in which cases they're not going to become intoxicated by the commercial BTs. There's no contact activity, so simply being in the presence of commercial BTs isn't enough. They really have to eat it. So there's no direct impact of temperature on the product itself, but there is an impact of temperature on the insect itself. And so that's where we see the effects of temperature in the field. Now, this is a video I'd shown previously. So this is a lettuce feeding assay, in this case with second instar diamondback moth. So on the left-hand side, we have a control. This is a leaf dip assay, where the leaves are dipped into either, in the middle there is a BTA formulation of BT, and on the right-hand side is chlorantraniliprole, or the also called Rynaxypyr, or you might find Coragen or Altacor in the field. Now you can see this is a time lapse over in the upper right-hand corner. You can see the number of days that are passing. And if I just start this over again, you'll notice that after about 24 hours, the larvae, both in the BT and the diamide treatments, are actually still relatively active. In the BT treatment, even though those larvae aren't feeding, you can see this one running around like crazy, even up until the second day after application. And this is important to note, because when assessing the effectiveness of a commercial BT application, looking the next day, looking for efficacy later that day, won't necessarily show you what you're going to expect. Commercial BTs have no knockdown activity, and so for that reason, to assess the efficacy of a standalone BT application, it's best to wait a day or two to allow the product to kill the insect through the longer process of sepsis or blood poisoning, because we're not having an acute effect on the insect. We're causing them to stop feeding and then eventually die through other processes. So for that reason, giving some time before going back out into the field can ensure that you're going to get a really good idea about what actually happened. In this example here, we have what is a much later instar. And you can see that that insect, while we wouldn't expect to effectively kill this insect with a BT, you could see that following a BT application, it's become lethargic, it's not running away. It's definitely acting in a certain way that suggests that it's become intoxicated. This larvae at this stage may not necessarily be killed by the BT, but it's definitely going to slow it down. This is where it also becomes more susceptible to other insecticides, and using that combination for these later instars can be really valuable. Now, commercial BTs are known also to have a broad tank mix compatibility. So tank mixing may be necessary to enhance control or to optimize a number of trips through the field. Now, the only thing that we really need to be, there are two things to keep an eye out for. The first is strong oxidizers, or other compounds that can damage the proteins before application. So for example, oftentimes commercial BTs are used for organic pest control, in which case they can be applied with copper. Long exposure, so over a number of hours, to copper will eventually degrade those cryoproteins. So products like that, even some water treatments, can cause protein degradation. Now, products that cause tank pH to exceed around pH 8 to 8.5 can cause the crystals to dissolve prematurely and impact efficacy. Now, the reason why we get 3 to 5 days of activity on the leaf is because crystals are, I mean, they're the strongest, some of the strongest forms in nature. And so having those proteins, which are normally very labile and susceptible to damage, having them compacted into those crystals allows them to live a whole lot longer in the environment. So if we dissolve those crystals prematurely in an alkaline solution, then we then expose them to the environment, where we would expect them to lose their efficacy much quicker. So before tank mixing, testing the mixture with a jar test, not only for physical compatibility, but also to see the final pH, can be a good practice. Of course, always adhere to label restrictions against mixing if products do restrict the use of mixing, and always follow the strictest label limitations of any product in the tank mix. So just because you include a BT in the mix doesn't necessarily mean you've made that mixture any lower risk than the most toxic component in that mixture. Now, another thing to keep in mind is around fungicides. So fungicides or bactericides. You might automatically assume that anything that kills a bacteria would probably be detrimental to a commercial BT. But keep it in mind that the cry proteins, that those crystals are really the primary mode of action. Then the loss of some spores is not always going to be consequential. The relative impact of spores varies between species. However, the spores themselves are not toxic. It's a contributor to the toxicity, not the toxic component alone. So even if you have something that may impact those spores specifically, it may not affect the overall efficacy of the product. Now, I don't want to give specific recommendations. However, for Valent Biosciences products, for example, the Dipel and Zentari labels, we have a field trial database going back to the early 80s. And I pulled out every product that we had tested, at least in a combination, and those are listed here. You can see it covers a broad spectrum of insecticides, fungicides, and then other tank mix partners, including things like oils or even UV protectants like this carnauba wax or sulfurs. And in all these cases, we haven't necessarily seen any specific combinations that are incompatible, except, of course, those that will dramatically increase the tank pH and maintain it very high. Now, commercial BTs are also compatible with adjuvants. So spreaders that support coverage, or especially stickers that prevent wash-off, can be beneficial, but they're not always necessary for application. For the sake of time, I'll skim over this one, but we did recently do a study on the impact of water quality. So the starting pH used in a tank mix. So in this case, we mixed the Dipel DF formulation in water that was either pH 4, 7, or 10. To determine if the starting pH of the water made a significant difference on efficacy. What you see here is the mortality of diamondback moth, second instar diamondback moth. And you can see that the starting pH of the water actually wasn't so consequential with this particular formulation. And that was because commercial BTs tend to be very acidic. And so for that reason, it actually efficiently neutralized the high pH of that water source. So this is why doing a jar test can be really important, especially if your local water source is very alkaline, to ensure that the products that you're using will neutralize the pH. If they don't, it may be necessary to use some kind of buffering agent. And finally, when it comes to storing commercial BT products, formulation makes a really big difference. On the left-hand side here, we have the potency of this material in international units, and along the bottom, the months in storage. So the two examples here are a dry granule formulation, which maintained potency at 25 degrees Celsius through 36 months. So this is 3 years in storage at 25 degrees Celsius. Now, even at these relatively normal temperatures of 25°C, we see about a more than 60% potency loss in the water-based formulation. And this potency loss is exacerbated by high storage temperatures. So it's always important to follow label recommendations for storage temperature and duration. However, especially in the case of water-based formulations, prolonged exposure to high temperature, for example, non-ventilated storages, can dramatically impact the efficacy of those products, especially the liquid formulations. The worst case I've seen for a dry formulation was it was about 3 to 4 years of storage in a non-ventilated environment where we started to see dramatic efficacy loss. But the liquid formulations are far more acutely susceptible. They don't need to be refrigerated necessarily, but it's an important consideration to keep in mind. And so with that, I'll end with the top 10 considerations for using a BT, really a summary of everything that we've talked about today, beginning with applying as early as is possible, making follow-up applications as necessary, or using a tank mix partner. Coverage is key. So for best results, of course, ensuring full coverage and the lowest volume of water can ensure the best efficacy. Since BT work through ingestion, they're not systemic, coverage is really important. We had just talked about watching the tank pH and being able to use all of the equipment that you have. Now, of course, mixing is okay as BT are compatible with other insecticides, fungicides, and additives, but doing a jar test can ensure that you'll get the most out of your application. We didn't talk about rain fastness, but BT does have some level of rain fastness. Those crystals and spores can kind of wedge themselves within the leaf architecture, but avoiding applications in rainy weather can be valuable, and reapplying if rain occurs before the product dries will be absolutely necessary. So you should expect some wash off from a rain event. Now, applying, they can be applied at day or night, and of course, agitation is required. So these are just really the top 10 considerations, the easy take home that summarizes everything that we've talked about today. And so with that, I'll close with a reminder that when you want to get the most out of a commercial BT, to be successful, you want to focus on timing and coverage and all things that contribute to that.
Daniel, that was fantastic. Wow, I'm actually going to watch that again because I really like how you've used that. Yeah, no, but also you've just really visually reinforced those top 10 tips, which I think is really important in a really nice way that's quite simple to understand, which is great. So thank you so much for that. Got some questions here that I've been saving up. If anyone else has got questions, here's your chance to get them answered. You've got a reaction there already, but really fantastic. So I can't say too much. I mean, I would like to say more, but it's really fantastic today to see those examples. So getting into some questions, we're going to start with this one, and there was a couple of questions earlier on as well around farmers and farmer using BT. So I guess this question was more around, well, how do you best work with farmers to socialize or introduce BT to their practices? Is there any examples where you've sort of worked with smallholder farmers? I mean, maybe you may not need to tell us all the results now, but are there any tips that sort of get farmers sort of trusting this sort of type of new biopesticide for them, or even just a new solution for them? Is there things that work better than others, or that you've seen that's worked well in the field?
Yeah, so I'd appreciate if Chris could give his comments here, but I've mostly worked with distributors and other folks that work with farmers, and in those cases, seeing is believing. That seems to always be the case.
Yeah,
seeing is believing.
Yeah.
But maybe Chris, do you have some comments on that?
Yeah. Yes, Daniel. Thanks. Of course, in several countries in Southeast Asia, The BT is a very, very well accepted product. And number one, I would say, is the oil palm segment. Oil palm, it is used for different kind of lepidopteran pests. For the foliar caterpillars we are using, and for the bunch caterpillars it's using. And of course, it is being used for different vegetables, of course, and cabbages, cauliflower, and solanaceous crops, and all those things. As Daniel explained, to see the results, it may not be as attractive as you see in the chemical pesticides. You cannot see the insects dying in front of you on the day one. You have to have some kind of a patience. But again, if the timing is proper, you can see the larvae totally inactive within few hours. Within few hours, you don't have to wait for even longer time. Those who have little bit of the acceptance problem, they would take maybe 1 or 2 times or 3 times, but then once they are convinced with the product, and they will definitely go for the BT product. That is what is my experience with the planters and the vegetable growers in Southeast Asia. Yes, there will be some people have some resistance initially, because the mindset is like the chemical mindset. They would expect the larvae to die instantly. But when we try to explain scientifically and try to understand how the product works, probably they will accept it. They'll understand the product very well. That's what is my experience in the region.
That's great feedback, Chris. I mean, I like what you said, Daniel. Both of you said seeing is believing, but it's also explaining that it's seeing and believing is it's not just about an instant kill, or I think you had the knockdown effect. They're not going to be completely just killed right in front of you, and you'll see all these dead insects. But it's about looking over a couple of days and actually seeing what actually happens. So I think that's a really important lesson. It's a really important part of integrated pest management and education around that. So it's a good point. And Chris, you mentioned a few things there too, and Daniel, you might have an answer here, but Pierre's asking, do you know if your BT formulations are more used in the organic production, and on which crops are they more applied?
Daniel, okay, Daniel, you can continue. Yeah.
No, go ahead, because you can speak more to the Southeast Asia.
Yeah, we have BT products, both organic certified and non-organic also. And most of our dry formulations are organic certified, and some of our liquid formulations are not organic. It is not certified. But of course, if you look at the use pattern, it is used both for non-organic as well as organic as well. So it is very much accepted in organic segment. And non-organic, as I said, oil palm. Oil palm, they want the oils free of residues of any chemicals. So when they are looking for any chemical which can be used on the bunches, on the oil palm bunches, and this is the only way to control or to reduce or eliminate the residues. So that is very well accepted. But of course, in this segment, both certified and non-certified products are also used. Yeah.
And from a global perspective, in some markets like the United States, organic is a dominant use. But outside the U.S., it's actually not. Probably the dominant use is in conventional crops, not necessarily organic.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, okay, great. Here's a question here. I'm just looking at it. Oh, now here we go. Sorry, I've got questions written down everywhere on my piece of paper from before and also here. But in case of 2 applications of BT, how many days between the 2 applications? That was the question from somebody in the room.
So depending on the level of infestation, and maybe Chris can confirm this, but 5 to 7 days between application is as far as you'd want to go if you're using a commercial BT as a standalone treatment.
Chris, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with Daniel. Yes, it is generally 5 to 7 days is good enough. But then in some cases where the infestation level is very high, people are even going for a little closer rounds, like 2 applications in a week, 3 to 4 days applications. That again, if the infestation is too high, it happens.
Okay.
Otherwise, 5 days is good enough.
Okay. Excellent. Now, another question here is, now when farmers, when you buy this product, and I know you can only speak for your own product, but how much does and this is a very practical question, how much does a farmer normally have to buy? I mean, can they buy small amounts, or is it, I mean, because sometimes you may only have 2 hectares, for example. So are you forced into buying quite a lot at once, or are there sort of different solutions and amounts that you can buy for different farmers' needs?
I think product available in small package also, 500 ml package and half kilo packages are all available. So you did not have to buy a huge quantity, but most of the BT products are recommended to be used at a low rate only, something around say half kilo to 1 kilo per hectare, depends on the label rate. So no need to buy a large quantity. I think small packs are available in the market.
Yep. Excellent. Thanks. Now I have a question here, and it's quite a lengthy question, and you've sort of answered this in the session, but I'm just going to put it out there. You showed the test of BT on the second instar diamondback moth in day 1, 2, and 3. Which day is the BT effective, and the effective percentage on the second instar?
So the day that's effective is within hours of application.
Okay.
So Chris was mentioning just a minute ago about how you don't necessarily see the larvae falling off the leaf, but you can notice that they'll become lethargic and they'll stop feeding. And that's what's really important about those pictures, is that even though those larvae may still be moving around, once you start perforating their stomach, they can no longer digest food. And they'll stop eating. I mean, that's just as plain and simple as that. So it will effectively stop feeding as early as within hours of application. And across I don't quite understand the rest of the question, but by 3 days, everything should be dead. That's the sort of our, whenever we do assays like that, looking out in the field, by 3 days after application, if a larvae is going to be killed by a commercial BT, it will be dead by 3 days.
Yep. Okay. No, that's excellent. No, that's good response there, and I think that sort of answers most of the question. I've got one last question here before we end, and it's somebody asked, how do you see the future of BT technology? What kind of advances might be coming in the future? Thanks for that question. Somebody, we're really going to put Daniel on the spot here from what's commercialization, what's on the horizon, what are the new advances?
So what I've seen on the horizon for commercial BTs is really is not to say strain engineering, but the types of strains that we find in the marketplace. There's some really interesting new strains coming out in Brazil that are introducing new cry proteins that haven't been seen in the market yet. There's been a great deal of innovation in the types of insecticidal proteins that are introduced into genetically modified crops, but that same level of innovation hasn't been put into the sprayable form quite yet. But now with the incredible myriad of tools that are available to researchers for selecting something new and for using genetics and those kind of tools to identify something that's really unique, I think that's the first thing you'll see coming to the market. Aside from small changes in formulations or concentrations, the biggest changes are going to be in the types of strains that we see coming to the market. Or combinations therein. Those are going to be the big moves for the future.
Excellent. That's a great place to leave it, I think. So yeah, it was a great question, I thought. But it's a great place to leave it as well. It's always nice to think about the future and also what's happening. So Daniel, I don't know if you can share the slides just again at the end, because I was just going to put up a reminder to everyone about what's coming up. But while you're doing that, I'm going to just take the opportunity to really thank you and Chris and Katie and the team, and also bringing us that footage from Thailand. I mean, it's really nice to see it visually and have a reminder of what you're talking about, sort of at the same time of what happens in the field. And you've got lots of reactions, by the way. You've got lots of hearts there and lots of thumbs up were coming through. So I think it was absolutely super. So we're really pleased, and thank you so much. So we're looking forward to continuing the relationship as well, and working together in the future. So
Likewise.
So thank you from me. I'd also like to just thank everyone for joining us today. I'd like to invite you to our next session, which will be on the 11th of August. We'll be looking at that new frontiers sort of space, and maybe sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit, and looking even maybe a bit longer term than just in the next sort of 5 years, but even beyond. So it could be a really interesting session, I think. Not could, it will be. And then we're following it up with quite a few other sessions through the year. So please join us for those sessions. Just moving forward, and just a reminder, you can register for all those sessions on the ASEAN Fall Army Action page. You can also watch all these sessions as well, which will be posted there, and I'll send an email out per usual. Just on the last slide, Daniel, I'm just going to remind everyone that this is the ASEAN Action Plan and Fall Army, where we're really excited to have everyone join this action plan, and we're really grateful to the overall donor and sponsors, in particular the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, but also the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development in Vietnam, and ASEAN Secretariat in Grow Asia, and soon to be CSIRO as well, who will be helping out with the Secretariat services. So thank you to everyone. I'd wish you a very happy July, which is going to be starting very soon, and we'll see you back in August. So take care. And to you, special mention to Daniel and Chris. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.